let me go back. How many of you have taken a course at Watkins Institute? How many of you have taken a course from today's speaker, Stephen Womack? I have, and it was wonderful. I mean, I thought Watkins Institute downtown when I first came to town was just the best thing because you could park downtown. You were welcome downtown. And then they moved over to Fountain Square, and that was okay. I got over there and everything was okay. My grandkids went there for summer camp too. I mean, it was part of Nashville. And Stephen Womack is going to make you aware of the story that is behind why it isn't now. Here's Stephen.
Thank you. I'm going to kick my jacket here. That's okay. It's fine. It's fine. Thank you all very much. I always appreciate the chance to talk about Watkins. It was not only a significant part of Nashville's history for 135 years, but for 25 years it was part of my personal history. I taught there for 25 years, and it was a big, big part of my life. So let's start in the beginning. Where did Watkins come from? It came out of the legacy of Samuel Watkins, who was born, I believe, an orphan, barely educated, but he was hardworking and industrious, and he grew up and he made a fortune. What I've read, and I can't guarantee this is absolutely accurate, but he made a fortune supplying bricks to the Union Army during the Civil War. And he died in 1880, and he was reported to be the richest man in Nashville. He left $100,000, which I might remind you was a lot of money in 1880. He left $100,000 in his will, and a lot at the corner of High Street and Church Street. High Street was later 6th Avenue, in trust to the state of Tennessee to establish a school for that would make education affordable to people who otherwise might not be able to get it. He got pretty specific in his will. He outlined a plan to keep the school going in perpetuity, that they would build a building and there would be a basement and a first floor which would be rented out, and then the upper floors would be occupied by Watkins Institute. Now, 135 years later, the way in which Sam Watkins structured his bequest would come back to haunt the institution and the people who loved it. Under the terms of his will, Watkins Institute would be a ward of the state. The operation of the school would be overseen by 3 commissioners appointed by the governor, and then the Board of Trust. What this meant in some ways that Watkins was in legally a kind of a limbo. Watkins was never a state school. It was not part of the Tennessee Board of Regents. There were some attempts made, I believe, at some point later in the school's existence to have it become part of the state school system, but it didn't. And so it didn't receive any regular financial support from the state legislature, but it wasn't technically a private school either. And I'm not an attorney, and I don't have a claim to have an understanding of what this meant, but I don't think there was a school anywhere else in the state, and maybe nowhere else in the country, that occupied quite the legal situation that Watkins did. And over a century and a quarter later, the disposition of this situation would wind up in court. After a few early stumbles in its search to define itself, Watkins Institute became enormously successful. Generations of immigrants would learn English. They would study to become United States citizens. In the very beginning, education was provided free, at the elementary, primary, and technical level. During the Depression, thousands of students would go to Watkins to further their education, to get training for jobs in hopes of finding jobs. Young women, including my grandmother, Ethel Hawkins Womack, over 100 years ago, attended Watkins to acquire homemaking skills. She took sewing, home economics, canning. Young people took typing, bookkeeping, skills like that. Young men worked on their math and reading skills. But what emerged relatively early in the school's history was that art was going to become a central focus at Watkins. Watkins hired its first art teacher, Edwin Garner, in 1910. Drawing, painting, sculpture quickly became key components of the school's curriculum. Eventually, Watkins would occupy an essential part of the Nashville art scene. The school became kind of a key player. Many years later, some fairly famous artists went to Watkins. Red Grooms attended classes at Watkins. And how many of you remember those pop art paintings from the 60s with the little kids with the great big eyes? Well, that was Margaret Keane, who became a very famous, well-off artist. She went to Watkins, and Tim Burton later did her biopic called Big Eyes. So, and in the post-World War II era, literally thousands of returning students continued their education at Watkins under the GI Bill. At its peak in the late 1940s, almost 5,000 students were enrolled at Watkins, which is kind of hard to believe. Generations of high school dropouts returned to night school at Watkins to finish their high school diplomas. But somewhere along the line, in the late 40s and the early 50s, the numbers began to wane, began to drop off. Decades later, Dr. David Hinton, who I'll have much more to say about later, he played a pivotal role in Watkins' evolution from an institute to a college. He speculated in an interview with me that the creation of the General Educational Development Test, better known as the GED, caused Watkins to take a hit. The GED program was created by the War Department in the middle of World War II in 1942 so that GIs could complete their high school diplomas while they were still in the service. Once the war was over and GED programs began to just perpetuate everywhere, Watkins lost some business because you didn't have to go downtown at night. There were hundreds of ways to finish your high school diploma. And let me step aside here for a second. What I'm talking now are I was explaining to Gene, there was a time in my life where if somebody asked me to speak for an hour, I'd have a panic. And then, for 25 years at Watkins, I taught classes that were 3 hours long. So being asked to speak for an hour means I got to rush and get through this stuff, or I'm not going to have time. Earlier this year, I published a memoir of my years at Watkins, and my memory of the last years of Watkins, and it's called Death of a College, and it's an ebook. I started out to write it as a magazine article. It very quickly became too long to be a magazine article, and then it became too short to be a print book. It's about 75 pages long. So it's available on Kindle, on Amazon.com, called Death of a College, where I go into a lot more of this stuff than we'll have time for today. But by the late 70s and the early 80s, it was clear that school was in trouble. Watkins Institute was in trouble. The numbers were down. The school existed largely by rent from the F.W. Woolworth Company. The Watkins building at 6th and Church, the first street level was Woolworth's. and then the basement was Woolworth's, and then Watkins occupied the top stories. And Woolworth's I don't know the exact year, but Woolworth's actually, I think about 1992 or 1993, actually abandoned that store, but they continued to pay rent to Watkins until their lease contract expired. And the other thing that was keeping Watkins alive was a contract with the Metro Nashville public school system to, we used to call it educating the incorrigibles. If you flunked out of or were kicked out of every other public school in Nashville, you went to Watkins at night, and that was an interesting time. So believe me. So by the early 90s, Watkins was in pretty serious trouble. They fired the director of Watkins Institute, and discussions among the board, and I'm not privy to the development of this, but eventually the decision was made to try to turn Watkins into a real college. So a fellow enters the picture now whose name was Brian McQuistion. Brian had been was a West Point graduate. He had spent his career in the Army as an intelligence officer. He was in the closing years of his Army career in an administrative post in Fort Campbell. And he picked up, the way he told me was, he picked up the paper one day, and in the classified ads was an ad that Watkins Institute needed a new president. And so Brian applied for the job and got it, and became actually the first president of Watkins. Whoever ran it before then was always called the director. And I was very fond of Brian. I met him early on. In fact, when I interviewed for a faculty position there, I met him, and I told him, I'm aware of Watkins. My grandmother took sewing here back in the 20s. I did not understand that every person he had met claimed that their grandmother took sewing at Watkins, and he was really sick of listening to that. So, but Brian told me that one of the things he marveled at was that people loved working there. By the time he became president of Watkins, they were really running it on a skeleton staff. There were a couple of faculty members and a couple of staff members, and then everybody else was a part-time instructor. And as he told me, there was one computer in the entire building. He said the salaries were terrible. Brian told me that he was aghast at what they offered him to become president of the college, and the only reason he could take the job was because he had a military pension. The benefits were practically non-existent. The resources were very slim, and yet people loved being there. They loved working there. They were devoted to Watkins, and this was something that continued on until the college closed. People loved, for the most part, people loved working. The ones that didn't left, but people stayed there for extraordinarily long amounts of times, put in incredible amounts of overtime. And less than a year after Brian was hired, the movement toward creating a college began. And at this point, another player comes on stage, the fellow I mentioned early, Dr. David Hinton. David was from Iowa. He went to Drake University. He had a graduate degree in film. He studied film in Germany as a graduate student, where he met and became friends with Albert Speer, whom some of you may remember. And he described it to me that he was sitting in Albert Speer's living room one night talking to him, and he said to Mr. Speer that he was a great fan of the German filmmaker, director, documentarian Leni Riefenstahl, and that he loved her work and would love to meet her. And he said Albert leaned over and pulled a notebook out of the table next to him and said, well, here's her number, give her a call. And as a result, Leni Riefenstahl and David Hinton became very close friends and stayed that way until she passed away at the age of 103, I think she was. Yes. And so David, who had lived in Iowa, he was an investment advisor, counselor, a stockbroker, and very involved in Iowa politics, had a kind of midlife crisis and decided that he needed to take a different path. So he applied to Vanderbilt and got into their graduate program and moved his family to Nashville to complete his PhD in education at Vanderbilt. And while he was there, he was looking for ways to make a little extra money. So he became an artist model at Watkins. And he was working with Madeline Reed. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but Madeline was one of the longest serving fine arts faculty members in Watkins history. She was there, I think, 34 or 35 years before she finally retired, and she was absolutely beloved as a teacher and a person. People just revered her, and she hired David as an artist model, and he worked a semester or two there, and then he went in, as he explained it to me, went in at the beginning of the semester and said, what's my schedule for this semester? And she said, I don't need you as a model anymore. I need you to teach here. So David became an adjunct art instructor at Watkins. And then when Brian was hired and the real impetus to turn Watkins around and into a college started, the job was posted as dean of the school. And Madeline encouraged David to apply for the job, and he got it. So at this point, he had finished his PhD, and he started out as an artist model, and then a few short years later was the chief academic officer of the entire institution. So the one thing about Watkins is there was always room for advancement. If anything, I'm proof of that. I started out as an adjunct in 1995. So it was David who, Brian McQuistion, in an interview I did with him, told me, he said, David was a bold, visionary kind of guy. He said, sometimes the execution could be a little bit of a challenge, but David had great ideas. And one of the first things David did was propose that Watkins start a film school. Now, at the time in Tennessee, there were no film schools. There were some colleges and universities that offered film classes, a few film majors, but were there any film schools, production-oriented film schools? No. If you wanted to study film and prepare yourself for a career in film, you went to the closest places were NCSA, North Carolina School of the Arts, or you went to FSU, which became part of our story a little later. So let me take a second here and explain what I mean by film school. If you're a film major at a college, you'll take some history classes and some critical studies classes and some scholarly classes, and you might take a production class, you might not. You might actually make a short movie in your 4 years as an undergraduate, and then again you might not. Or invariably you would take the most mealy-mouthed of all film courses, film appreciation, right? So that's not what a film school is. A true film school is a production-oriented, technically craft-oriented, as well as scholarly and historically oriented program. Now, as I said, there was room for advancement at Watkins. In time, I went from being an adjunct to an assistant professor, and then I became a full professor, and then I became chair of the film school for 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. And I used to explain, as chair of the film school, a big part of my job was promoting the program and becoming kind of the public face of the program. And I used to tell prospective students and parents, you don't come to the Watkins Film School and major in film. We don't have any film majors at Watkins. What you do is you come to the Watkins Film School and you major in one of the 5 major components of the filmmaking process. You major in producing, directing, screenwriting, cinematography, or editing. So in the beginning days of the film school and for the bulk of its history, you got a BFA in screenwriting. So our students were very specifically trained. So Brian, again, told me that he and David were sitting there talking one day, and he said, I love the idea of starting a film school. The only problem is we don't have any money, we don't have any equipment, we don't have the facilities, we don't have any faculty members, and we don't have any students. So what do we do? And David's answer was, hold a press conference and make the announcement. And that's what they did. And then, again, a little sideways segue here. I knew David before he became the dean at Watkins. As I mentioned, David was quite close to Leni Riefenstahl. And in 93, I guess it was in 1992, St. Martin's Press published the English language edition of her memoirs. And David, Leni Riefenstahl, let David option the English language film rights. So for a brief amount of time, David owned the English language film rights to Leni Riefenstahl's memoirs. So I had, but a chain of events that we don't have time to go into now, I had just written my first movie. I'd been teaching screenwriting at Tennessee State University and Nashville State, what was then Nashville State Technical Institute. It's Nashville State Community College now. And I'd been teaching there, and through a chain of events, I wound up writing one of the very first movies that was ever, may have been the first movie ever backed by the Nashville Network. And a fellow named Jack Cole, who was an award-winning music video director, had gotten this deal to shoot a cable movie, and it was released in 1994, I guess. And there's an adage in the movie-making business, the worse the shoot, the better the movie. And this was a very troubled shoot. They had weather problems. The director, Jack Cole, and the producer, whose name, thank God, I can't remember, finally they got to the point where they couldn't be in the same room together. They ran out of money. There was a blizzard in the middle of shooting. And yet it wound up being a fairly nice little movie called Proud Heart. And its distinction is not only that it was, I think, the first movie ever produced by TNN, but it was also the country music star Lori Morgan's, I believe, her only film. I don't think she's ever done another one. And it was nominated for a Cable Ace Award. So it, did better than anybody expected. And there was an article in The Scene about it. So David read this article in The Scene, and this was back in the days where we still had white pages, and my number was in the phone book. And he called me one day, and he said, "You want to have lunch? I want to talk to you." And I was intrigued and never wanted to turn down a free lunch. So he and I met down at Hillsborough Village at a restaurant, and he asked me if I would write the screenplay to this project with Leni Riefenstahl. And it took me about 5 seconds to go, hell yes. Oh yeah, count me in. And eventually nothing came of it, as so often happens in the movie business. But David and I became friends, and when he got the green light to start a film school, he came to me and said, "Would you teach screenwriting?" And I said, "Of course." So in August of 1995, I started teaching screenwriting in the first semester of the Watkins film student. David and Brian McQuistion hoped at the time that they'd pull 30 students in. If they got 30 students, they'd be happy. They pulled 114. So the school took off. And when I say I was the first faculty member hired at Watkins, it's not because there's anything particularly special about me as a teacher or what I do. If you're teaching cinematography, you got to buy some expensive cameras. If you're teaching editing, you have to buy an expensive editing bay. If you're teaching screenwriting, you need a blackboard. That's it. And if you can find a television and a VCR and some old VHS movies to show your students, so much the better. So we rolled out the film school in August of 1995. 3 months later, David, of course, was academically running the whole college, and Brian was running the whole college. So there basically was nobody in charge of the film school, and a woman named Valerie Stover, who had just graduated from the Masters of Fine Arts program at FSU in film, which is one of the finest film schools in the country, in the world. She was passing through Nashville because she had a passion for songwriting and thought she might want to go that way. And she dropped by the school and wound up getting a job as the first chair of the Watkins Film School, which she kept for 12 years. So that was the early challenges, were finding the resources to get the equipment we needed and finding faculty. Valerie recruited 2 other FSU graduates, a fellow named Van Flesher, whom Sam knows, and Andrew Newell. And then from the North Carolina School of the Arts, Valerie recruited a film editor named Deneen Rowan. So we're up and running very quickly. The school grew very quickly, but we had all kind of challenges. For one thing, that building at the corner of 6th and Church, that was over 50 years old at that point, and it was badly in need of repair. The aging building was inadequate. The roof leaked. The heat didn't work in the wintertime. Space was limited. The infrastructure was deteriorating. It was dimly lit and dusty. And of course, the Metro Public School incorrigibles were still there. So we would time our bathroom breaks so that we didn't meet them in the bathroom. And at night, when we were leaving out on 6th Avenue, the front entrance was out onto 6th Avenue, we would go in groups to the parking lot because it was a little bit creepy, 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. And the sad state of the Watkins building kind of reflected the overall state of downtown Nashville itself. Nobody visiting Nashville for the first time today would believe that there was a time in the late 80s and the early 90s where downtown Nashville was practically deserted after dark. The 2 major downtown department stores that anchored Church Street, Harvey's and Castronaut, had closed. There were a few blocks of rundown honky-tonks down Broadway, and Printer's Alley was rocking, but that was a little bit intimidating too. But, there was no Bridgestone Arena with Taylor Swift concerts and Predators games. There were no Hard Rock cafes, no Jimmy Buffett-themed restaurants, no throngs of tourists and horse-drawn carriages and howling drunk bridesmaids on pedal taverns. None of that stuff was happening. No country music stars had opened up their own tourist traps. And as I joked, the Acme Seed and Feed still sold Seed and Feed rather than, overpriced cocktails and $17 hot chicken sandwiches. Nashville had not yet become the it city. But once you got up Broadway, it was a few blocks past the foot of Broadway, up from the river. It was almost a ghost town. So there were attempts, as you know, a longtime Nashville resident, so there had been attempts to revitalize the downtown before. The Church Street Center, the big shopping mall that went up on Church Street, they attempted to turn it into a shopping destination, and that didn't work. So in 1991, a fellow named Phil Bredesen was elected mayor, and then he was reelected again 4 years later, and this time he was determined to revitalize the downtown area, and one of the earliest plans called for a massive world-class public library that occupied the entire block between 7th and 6th, Church and Demonbreun. And that meant that Watkins had to go. The city of Nashville bought that building. And for the first time in our lives, we actually had some cash, which was nice. But then we had to figure out where to go. And there was a lot of talk about where Watkins would relocate. There was pressure, I believe, people wanted us to move to 5 Points in East Nashville. There was some talk that we would move out to a facility out Nolensville Road. And then, of course, for us, the faculty, the most exciting prospect was the Free Will Baptist Bible College campus was for sale, and down West End. And that went so far as the faculty and staff was given a tour of the facility. And we were excited. They had a gym, they had a pool, they had dorms. It would feel like a real school. The problem is that the Free Will Baptist Bible College, upon further review and inspection, was badly in need of what could, I guess, diplomatically be called deferred maintenance. Their infrastructure was in bad shape. So Watkins had to move. We didn't know where we were going. There's about this time that Brian McQuistion decided to retire, and Watkins moved into rental property in a building next door to the Home Depot in 100 Oaks. And we were there for several years. A fella named Jim Brooks, who had been the chair of the Department of Theater and Speech at MTSU, been the associate dean at MTSU, he became president of Watkins. And we moved into this rental space, and those were really good years. That space was a good one. It was small, but whoever was in charge of repurposing the building to turn it into a college had done a really good job. Those were great days. We were starting to get noticed out in Hollywood. Talia Shire, the actress Talia Shire, came to our campus and visited it. Jamie Cromwell came and visited the campus. A Memphis director, Craig Brewer, who later went on to do Hustle and Flow and Black Snake Moan, he screened his first film, which was called The Poor and the Hungry, I think was the name of it. And he screened it for our students and explained how he shot this movie with a skeleton crew, and they built the lights from lumber and sockets they bought at Home Depot and shot it on weekends. And that got him a gig with Warner Brothers, which is now, he's gone on to have an incredible career. So those were good days. And in 2001, we finally found a permanent home. For those of you who remember the Fountain Square complex. Fountain Square, I don't know the year it was built, but it was an attempt to revitalize that part of Nashville, which had typically been somewhat dicey, lots of crime, and not anywhere near what it is today, where it's very upscale, but it was still largely a poorer part of town, and crime was a problem. So they built the Fountain Square complex, and on the far end of it was the AMC Fountain Square 14, which was Nashville's first multiplex theater. We'd never had one. And it was very popular for a number of years, but then they had some high-profile shootings at one of the nightclubs, and businesses began to desert it, and they went down until finally the whole complex went under. So we bought the Fountain Square 14 Theater, 76,000 square feet, I think it was, and repurposed it as a college. And we did do one thing, which I thought was extraordinarily cool. We kept one of the theaters, one of the original Fountain Square theaters became the Watkins Theater, and it was the center part of the Watkins Film School for many years after that. Okay, I got to get going here. In 2003, things were going great. George Bush took us to war, right? the Iraq War started. At first, nobody noticed on the Watkins campus. Our students, by and large, were artists. Watkins was still largely a commuter campus, so there weren't a lot of kids living on campus, and it wasn't very political. I was always aghast at how many of my students had never watched the news. So, but as time went on, this became it became more and more a politically unpopular war, and in 2005, two Watkins film students created a student film and entered it in the Brownlee Curry competition, which was an annual competition of Watkins students in all the different areas of film. And this film was called Fearful Symmetry, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it interspersed commercials for American consumer products, household cleaning products, the medicine, soap, hygiene products, all that kind of stuff, with film shot by terrorists in Iraq as they killed their hostages on camera. And they got this footage off a long defunct Dutch website called ogrish.com. And this was a powerful, powerful movie, very moving, very well done. Unfortunately, it was in many ways a public relations disaster. What they did was they incorporated a film of an American contractor being beheaded on camera. And the news got out, it made AP, the contractor's family threatened to sue us. It was a public relations disaster. We had a capital campaign going on by then, and I was told that a number of major donors had abandoned us because of this. Jim Brooks and David Hinton did their best, and they did a masterful job of controlling the bad press, but you just couldn't put that genie back in the bottle. And as a result, David Hinton wound up a short time later deciding to move on. He resigned and moved on to another school. So, boy, I'm running out of time. Then a fellow was hired to take his place named John Sullivan. And John Sullivan was hired as dean. He came out of Jackson State University. Sullivan, it's actually hard for me to talk about Sullivan. He came on board in 2006. In 2007, I was named chair of the film department. I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I didn't really want the job, but Valerie had stepped down and somebody else had to step up, and nobody else would take the job, so I took it. And for the next 5 or 6 years, John Sullivan became my mentor, one of my closest friends, and I really thought the world of him. I really did. And so shortly after that, again, we had recovered from the public relations debacle, I thought. Things seemed to be going well. Sullivan, everybody called him by his last name. Even his wife called him Sullivan. And Sullivan and Jim Brooks got along together very well. Things were running fairly smoothly. Jim Brooks decided to retire. The search for a new president began at this point. And again, I never intended to have a career in academia. I came into it by accident, by happenstance, and just kind of fell into it and loved it, stayed in it for 25 years. But I was appointed to the search committee to find a new president for Watkins. You would think that the search for the president of a college would be a solemn, formal, prestigious, important decision to make. The people who were applying for this job, I can't, please excuse my language, but they were a bunch of ass clowns. I'd never seen anything like it. Their resumes, their CVs looked great, and they did great in interviews, and then when you spend a little time with them, I mean, the chair of the Department of Interior Design was a woman named Jennifer Overstreet. And Jennifer was a brilliant designer. She had great credentials, great experience. She was a fabulous teacher. She was a lot of fun, very collegial, fun, amiable person who was also singularly attractive. She was tall, blonde, and very capable at everything she did. So there was this one guy who was a finalist for the president's position, and they invited the faculty to have lunch with him at a restaurant on Elliston Place, and we all got to the restaurant. This guy met Jennifer and glommed onto her like he'd met her in a hotel bar after work. I mean, we couldn't get it. He maneuvered so that he was sitting next to her at lunch and chatting her up, and we're like, what's going on here? And time after time after time. So the faculty, we got together and we talked kind of behind the curtain. And we decided that we felt like the most qualified person to be the next president of Watkins was already here. So we went to Sullivan and asked him to throw his hat in the ring. And he said, no, I'm going to decline that because that's really not appropriate. So the faculty, which is very unusual in academia, the faculty nominated him for president of Watkins. And for a time, he was the leading candidate until a last-minute candidate showed up, a woman who had been the president of the Atlanta College of Art and who had a long career in higher education, art college management. And her name was Ellen Meyer. And the search committee chose her. She became the next president of Watkins. And this was about 2007, I think. And of course, what happened shortly after she became president, we went into the worst economic slump since the Great Depression. Academia is always a year or two behind the regular economic calendar. We didn't feel the effects that much at first, but the numbers started to go down. Suddenly, parents who had lost their jobs or were underwater on their houses or any number of things didn't want to pay college tuition to send their kids to college to study art. So we got, one of the things that the board had commissioned the administration to do was to get SACS accreditation. SACS is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. They accredit colleges. And after many, many years, Sullivan finally got that accomplished. We were now accredited by the same accrediting body that accredited Vanderbilt and Sewanee and Auburn. In other words, we were a legitimate college, finally. We got reaccredited for the National Association School of Art and Design, and we got membership in ACAD, which is the Association of Independent Colleges of Art and Design. So after that was done, largely with the efforts of John Sullivan, a problem emerged which became clear over a very short amount of time, which is that Ellen Meyer and John Sullivan, they simply didn't like each other. And they didn't get along. And Sullivan told me, I did manage to get him to interview me about this. And he said, oh yeah, he said, you just run into this in life sometimes. It was personal. We didn't like each other. And I knew that, you know, it was not a hill I wanted to die on. So he resigned. John Sullivan resigned and went on to become president of the Art Academy of Cincinnati, where he stayed until he retired. And now he's a luthier. He makes really fine guitars and musical instruments and rides his BMW. He loves motorcycles. He told me at one point he was thinking about opening a bait shop. Why not? So anyway, this was the time really when, and I'm running out of time, I'm sorry. This is when things really began to go downhill. Now they look great on the surface. The college looked good. We opened a dorm. We opened then a few years later a second dorm. how many of you have ever heard of a woman named C.C. Reed? She was the wife of Jim Reed, Chevy. C.C. Reed had been a commissioner at Watkins. She'd been a teacher at Watkins for like 19 or 20 years. Again, another person on campus who was just loved. And she passed away and left Watkins a bequest, which enabled us to remodel the back of the building, which fronted out on the lake and now was facing across from the Tennessee Titans practice facility. Now, we used to joke that we could go out on the boardwalk and watch the Tennessee Titans practice. Not enough. But we built the C.C. Reed Student Center, but little by little, it became clear that we were in trouble. People would quit and they wouldn't be replaced. We didn't have the budget to hire adjuncts. The director of development quit. The person in charge of raising money for the college resigned and was not replaced. The registrar's office got down to where it was finally one person who closed the registrar's office on her lunch hour and drove Uber. She ran Uber rides on her lunch hour. So, there were a number of ugly incidents between faculty and staff, between faculty and students, and a place that had been collegial and conflict-free and very happy and pleasant to work with and to be at gradually began to change. So, and we began being, let me say, Watkins never had much of an endowment. Watkins was a tuition-driven institution. Now, what that means in academia is you're basically running the academic variant of a Ponzi scheme. You're paying your bills this semester with the money that came in last semester. And the money coming in this semester will pay the bills for next. So there was a constant struggle for cash for students. And gradually, Watkins students, our best students, were the best students I've ever seen in my life. They could have gone to any film school in the world and succeeded. Our other programs, I know I've talked about film, but we had a graphic design program, fine arts, photography, and interior design. They were award winners. They were innovative. They were progressive, cutting edge. I mean, Watkins was a much, much finer school than anybody ever gave it credit for. And Jim Brooks used to talk about, the worst thing going against Watkins now is they think it's where your grandmother took sewing. They don't understand that we have the first film school in the state of Tennessee, one of the best fine arts programs. So anyway, in 2015, Ellen Meyer retired, and a fellow named Dr. Joseph Klein became the president. He insisted that people call him by his first initial, J. We never figured out why. And that was when the last 5 years were particularly difficult. As I said, our best students would have survived and prospered anywhere. They would have excelled anywhere. But by the last 5, 6, 7 years, we were taking practically anybody. And that was very sad because a lot of these kids were just not equipped to go to college. We were taking in kids whose ACT scores were less than their age. And, that's problematic. And we used to joke, what's the application for Watkins? One question, will the check clear? So, which is very sad, and it saddened us. So, anyway, to cut to the chase, because I'm running out of time. In 2019, the next 5 years, I said, it felt like being on the ground, on the academic trenches. It felt like death by 1,000 cuts. And so in 2019, we had made it through the semester, made it to Christmas, and in December of 2019, my usual practice was when finals were done and the dust had settled, I would go into the building and just sit in my office and decompress for a while and clean up the mess and try to get things ready for the next semester. and I walked down to the staff wing of the building to say Merry Christmas to people. That was it. I was going to say goodbye to people. We had an interim dean then, Carrie Beth Miller, and I wanted to say goodbye to her. But there was only one person, everybody else had gone home. And the woman's name was Denise Fetz. And Denise and I always got along. She rode a Harley. You know, she rode a Harley. I mean, how do you not like a tall woman who rides a Harley and is a bodybuilder? And so I said, you know, Denise, how you doing? And I'm okay. She said, I'm just wrapping up some things. I've got to do the payroll for January because we won't be back early enough for me to get that taken care of. So I'll set up the payroll now. Got to take care of a couple other things. And then I'm out of here. And I said, well, have a nice Christmas. Thank you for everything. And she said, yeah, I'm going to wrap up a few other things. And then she said, and then we're out of money. And I went, I'm sorry, say again? And she said, yeah, we're out of money. She said, I can't make the January 15th payroll, and I can't pay the health insurance bill, and I'm not sure I can make the NES bill. And I went, so that was my Christmas of 2019, you know, wondering if I was going to have a job in January. Well, we came back to school in January, and a week and a half or so later, the announcement was made that Watkins was going to merge with Belmont. And this is me speaking personally, and I could be wrong. The former chairman of the Board of Trustees is here with us today, and he may have a different slant on it entirely, but I thought describing that as a merger was, frankly, putting lipstick on a pig. A merger is when two, you know, sort of equal bodies come together for mutual benefit and to achieve something else. And the truth is, Watkins was going under. And the only reason we were able to stay open in spring semester of 2020 were some lines of credit that kept the people paid and the lights on. And we were able to finish out the semester. Of course, in March of 2020, the tornadoes came through and the campus was spared, but there was no power in the Metro Center area for about a week. And right after that, spring break came, and over spring break was when the COVID pandemic hit. So by then, I was also teaching adjunct at Belmont to make extra money in their program. So I had 5 or 6 classes that I had to move to Zoom in 48 hours. I had to upgrade the Wi-Fi in my house to handle it all. And then Watkins' final graduation was done via Zoom, and the college closed. And they kept me on for the following summer because we had 2 people, one graduate student and one undergraduate student, who needed what's called a teach out, where they needed one class to graduate. We weren't going to leave them hanging. So I did independent studies with both of them over the summer, and they got their diplomas. So it's weird to think that I was the first faculty member hired at Watkins, and I was the last one out the door. Very strange feeling. So that was the end. A 135-year story came to a close. Now, you know, and we've got a few minutes left. I do want to do this. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. Why did the Watkins College of Art ultimately die? Now, you know, I think there were problems that went back a long way. I'll tell you this, in my experience at Watkins, talking very closely and very intimately with my colleagues, we often felt that we wondered if the board really knew how bad things were. We were down in the trenches. We knew. We knew the struggles. We knew the students. We knew the lack of resources. None of us had had raises for 12 years, and that was very difficult. And so, but on the other hand, that's not unusual in academia. I interviewed one person who said that it would have been very inappropriate for the faculty and the board to have interacted very much. There needs to be a wall. But the other thing is, I had, back in the 70s when I graduated from college, I had a brief career in university development. I worked at Vanderbilt in their first $100 million capital campaign, and this is the biggest campaign they'd ever done. Now, I'm not sure they turned the lights on for $100 million, but then it was a big deal. And a fellow named Alexander Hurd was the chancellor at Vanderbilt, and I didn't know him, but being part of the staff, I heard him speak. He spoke to us. We heard the things that he'd done and read. Alexander Hurd maintained that a university or college president or chancellor, whatever you call him, the guy at the top of a college had one job, and one job only, and that is to raise boatloads of money, to raise as much money as possible. And I don't think, as I had problems with some of the presidents. I got along very well with some of the presidents, but the one thing that is clear is that none of the presidents in my 25 years at Watkins had that entrepreneurial, raise money spirit, perspective, approach to their job. They were academically prestigious. They knew what they were doing. They were very learned people. But we needed a Steve Jobs. I mean, we needed an Elon Musk. I know that left a bad taste in my mouth too. What we needed was someone like Bill Trout, who assumed the presidency of Belmont University at the age of 32. Belmont was a sleepy little southern school that was largely a finishing school for southern young ladies in many respects, and a Southern Baptist school. Bill Trout, for the next 32 years, and his successor, Bob Fisher, who I did know, met him because we were working with Belmont on some projects. Bob Fisher's nickname was Bob the Builder. And those two guys took a sleepy little Southern Baptist school and turned it into one of the most powerful, prestigious universities in the country. So, maybe that would have changed things. On the other hand, and I'll wrap up with this, in 2011, Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen wrote a groundbreaking book called The Innovative University. And in this book, he predicted that half the colleges in America would close within 10 to 15 years. Half of them would close. So far, he hasn't been far off. When I was wrapping up my memoir, I was doing a little research to bring that to a close, and I did just a Google search. Since the COVID pandemic, 72 colleges have closed or merged with larger institutions. And art colleges have taken it particularly hard. Some of the finest and oldest art colleges in this country have gone under in the last 5 years. San Francisco Art Institute, the Delaware College of Art and Design, the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which I knew people who went there. I never would have thought that place would have closed. The Compass College of Film and Media, the New Hampshire Institute of Art, the Oregon College of Art and Craft, Pacific Northwest College of Art, University of the Arts in Philadelphia, the Memphis College of Art, and of course, our other institution here in town, the O'Moore School of Design. All of these colleges went under. That's not counting for-profit colleges. All 52 campuses of the Art Institute system, including the Art Institute of Tennessee out on Stewart's Ferry Pike, have gone under. So, put simply, art colleges have been gutted. Now, a lot of things come into play here. I'm a baby boomer. Most of you guys look like baby boomers too. We were brought up to believe that the key to a good life was a college education, right? neither of my parents went to college, and they pushed me to go to college. That was how you got a good career and a good life. Young people today, they're facing an entirely different picture. A college education for students today mostly means you're burdened with student loan debt. And parents are starting to realize this as well. Why should I shell out 6 figures to get my kid a degree in art? Why? How are they going to pay for it? So the value of a college education has come into question in the last 15 or 20 years. College has become insanely expensive. And then that's not even factoring in the myriad of college problems that this country faces right now. Wealth inequality, the disappearing middle class, ghastly expensive medical care. Trust me on this. I'm a cancer survivor. Wage stagnation, high inflation. It's all led to one thing. We ain't making enough babies. The American birth rate is about as low as it's ever been. And I saw a statistic this morning on a Yahoo investment newsletter that I read that less than half the households in America have a married couple living in them. People aren't getting married. They're not having babies. The birth rate hit a historic low in 2022. The American birth rate is not high enough to replace all us baby boomers who are going to be dying off in droves pretty soon, right? So it's a grim picture. And I don't know what's going to happen in higher ed, except that it's going to remain tough and challenging. I have a good friend who is a medievalist, who teaches at a small liberal arts college in South Carolina. And he's also a mystery writer, which is a nice combination. And he wrote in his blog earlier this year that he believes, and he's 62, that he believed he was in the last generation of Americans for whom a career in academia was a viable prospect. You know, becoming a college professor used to come with prestige and a good life and respectability. And most of the classes taught in American colleges now are taught by adjuncts who are part-time instructors, underpaid, no benefits, and in most cases treated fairly shabbily. So on that note, thank you very much for your time. I've enjoyed talking about this. Went over a little bit.